Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which will be the last webinar for 2024. I know that's kind of a scary thing to say, but time has flown already. The webinar today is introducing a screening platform for HPLC method development, and this is the final part of our three-part series titled A Systematic UHPLC and HPLC Method Development Strategy with Complementary Stationary Phases to Maximize Selectivity and Resolution. My name is Alex Nase from MacMod Analytical, and I will be moderating today's webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat window and include your name and company. We will answer as many as possible in the Q&A portion at the end. If you miss anything or would like to review the content, you will be able to watch a recording of the webinar and view the slides on MacMod's website. We will also send out a follow-up email to all registrants with links to the recording and the slides. And there's also a collection of our past webinars and resources on MacMod's website. So just to introduce MacMod, we are a chromatography company that offers scientists innovative solutions for their complex separation needs. We recommend and supply the best columns and accessories to our customers. We also provide application notes, technical reports, white papers, and other up-to-date resources from industry-leading scientists to keep you informed. Today's speaker is Gemma Lowe. Gemma is a global portfolio manager at Avantor based in the UK, responsible for the self-manufactured chromatography portfolio, which includes HPLC, UHPLC, GC, TLC, and sample preparation columns and workflow solvents. Gemma has over a decade of experience working in the high-chrome technical support team, troubleshooting chromatography methods, recommending suitable column chemistries, and supporting the vast range of chromatography columns. Additional experience in HPLC column manufacture and business development are used to support the portfolio. Originally a biochemist, focus areas include the analysis of biomolecules and polar analytes by various chromatographic techniques and working in close collaboration with the Avantor R&D and applications teams. Thanks for joining us today, Gemma, and hope I didn't scare you too much about the end of the year coming so quickly.
Thanks, Alex. I was thinking when you were introducing me how long the title of the overall webinar series was, so need to think about that one next year for a more catchy title. So hello and welcome to this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a screening platform for method development. We're thinking about the parameters to maximize selectivity and really an optimized and systematic approach to method development. So how can we do it more quickly, get a lot of information, and develop good methods within that selectivity space. So it builds on what we've talked about in the previous two webinars. If you haven't watched them, you can go back and watch the recording. If you have, then you'll know from the start what I'm talking about. So we're going to look at sort of how we do our method development using a screening approach. And I want to start by thanking MacMod for their partnership, their collaboration, and the invitation to speak today. Thanks. So in terms of where to start, and we get asked this question a lot when it comes to method development, what should I start with? I'm not going to say anything different to anyone else. C18 columns are a fantastic place to start. They will work for the majority of compounds if they are hydrophobic, and therefore they're always a good chemistry to have in your toolkit. However, they don't work for everything, and sometimes you might miss a really good method if you only work with a C18. So really what you want to do is maximize the selectivity space. Selectivity is a key parameter when it comes to separating your peaks of interest. It's the most powerful one we've got, and therefore if you can choose chromatographic columns that have different mechanisms of interaction. So by that, I mean different stationary phases that retain your compounds in different ways, then that is a really good place or a good toolkit to have for your method development. So we're quite lucky. We've got a 6-column switcher. So we actually do utilize 6 columns when we're doing our method development. And we choose columns that have different mechanisms of interaction. And you can see these here on the screen. These are our favorite columns. So we've got that straight alkyl chain from the C18. We've got something with an aromatic phenyl ring. We've got something with a pentaflora phenyl ring. So the opposite sort of pi-pi interactions. We've got an extended pH column, an embedded polar column, and a strong dipole in the cyano phase. And if you want to sort of look at the different mechanisms that these can have with your analytes, you can study this table and see that each column has a different weighting, a different capability in terms of how it interacts with your analytes. So they've all got strong hydrophobicity. That's how we retain compounds in reverse phase chromatography. But each of them has a different weighting in terms of the other ways they can retain compounds. What that means chromatographically is we'll get peaks in different places. We'll be able to move our peaks around on the different columns. And that's exactly what you want for method development. So you can see there's heavy weightings. If I can just bring up a pointer. Heavy weighting on the hydrophobicity. You've got some strong pi-pi interactions when you have aromatic stationary phases. This PFP and the cyano have got strong dipoles. And then you've got really quite a range of different shape selectivity based on sort of how that stationary phase interacts and how the analyte can fit within the stationary phase in terms of hindrance when you're looking at those. And we work this out by looking at test probes. Again, you can check your columns and see how similar or how different they are using different chromatographic techniques. One, for example, is Tanaka testing, and this is how we sort of got those weightings. You can see each column has a different weighting and therefore is a good choice when it comes to your method development. So as I mentioned, we're quite lucky. We've got those 6 stationary phases that we can use in our screening platform, and we can then compare each of the columns against each other for a given sample of analytes. To make things a little bit more wider in terms of that selectivity space, we can then also add in a second organic modifier. So our screening platform uses 6 columns and 2 organic modifiers. So methanol and acetonitrile, they'll have different interactions. They have a big influence on selectivity. And therefore, if we're utilizing both solvents here, we can see significant differences when it comes to selectivity. So this is how we have developed our screening platforms. This is where we start with any of our method development. With 6 columns, we choose a temperature, normally 40 degrees, I would say, is degrees Celsius. Sorry, coming from the UK. So 40 degrees C, and we choose generally a low pH. Our first run will be with 1 organic solvent, and we'll set the gradient time, and then analyze our sample on 6 different columns, 6 different stationary phases. The second will then bring in that second organic modifier. If we use acetonitrile on the first run, we'll use methanol on the second run. And that gives us a bit more information, a higher hit rate in terms of separating out our analytes. And it's been pretty successful, I would say, for the majority of the methods we've tried to develop. So we're quite lucky. We've got this 6-column switcher within our Hitachi instrument, and therefore we can put these columns on, equilibrate everything, leave it overnight, does all the runs. We can come back the next day and analyze the data. And our favorite column dimension is a 3 mil ID, 100 millimeter length, 2 micron. So it's kind of bordering on UHPLC, but actually the pressure is low enough you can run it on an HPLC instrument. So this is the general approach we take. We do our scouting runs before we optimize, validate, transfer, and implement. And again, I get asked, like, what starting conditions should we use? And we've developed these based on chromatographic theory and then put it into practice to prove that it works. So ideally, we want good retention of our analytes. You don't want them coming out too early near that solvent front. We kind of say between 2 and 20. I'd really like to say between 2 and 10. 10 is still a bit excessive in some cases. So when we plug these into our retention factor calculation, went for about 3 here. This is what we're aiming for. What that looks like in a method is a 5-minute gradient time running at 1.2 mils a minute. The gradient range, that's what this stands for, is 95. So we're not going to 100% aqueous because some of our columns can't cope with that. So 0 to 95% aqueous range. The volume here is the volume for our 100 by 3 mil ID column. And this M for small molecules, we can estimate as 5. If you're working with larger molecules, this number differs. But for small molecule separations, we're using 5 as a within this calculation. That gives us a retention factor within a gradient, so K star of around 3. Therefore, we should be getting good retention of our analytes in reverse phase using a 5-minute screening method. In terms of how quickly you can do this, if you actually think about what needs to happen in the lab, we want to equilibrate our column, we want to run a blank, we want to do replicate injections, and then we want to move on to the second modifier. So you have to do all of that again with acetonitrile if you've already done it with methanol. You also need to make sure you build in the column storage. So for each column, we've got 2 equilibrations, 8 gradients, and 1 column wash. If you're doing that with 6 columns, obviously it's 6 times that amount of runs. So the reason, I guess, we like moving to a smaller column dimension is if you're running this on a 154.65 micron, so standard HPLC dimension columns, using those kind of details that I specified in that K-star equation, the full run is 57.5 hours. So you can't run that overnight. That's going to take a couple of days. And it also uses 4 liters of solvent. If you move it to our favorite column, so the 10 centimeter 3 mil ID, 2 micron, actually, because you've scaled that method, you can get all those runs done more quickly. I can do this now in 16 hours. Therefore, I can set it up before I go home, come in the next day and have the chromatograms ready. So it's much quicker running on a smaller particle size versus that standard 5 micron. You also use less solvent. And I'm saying it's UHPLC, this pressure probably does, this flow rate does probably generate enough pressure to be classed as UHPLC. But of course, you could go even more extreme, go to a 5 centimeter column, 1.7 micron, and speed that up again as well. We just find this is a really nice compromise, and you can scale easily down or up depending on what your application is going forward. So with all that said, it makes a lot of graphically or once we've actually run this in the lab, it makes a lot more sense to me. So I'm going to run through an example or multiple examples of how we've utilized this technique. This one is, we're lucky here because we've actually got a known substance. We've got 10 components in our mixture, and we've got all of the information we have available here about the analytes of interest. What that means is we can look at some of these properties and say, is that screening method fit for purpose? In this case, we've got the 4-aminophenol, which is quite a polar compound. You can see from the log P value, it's got a negative log P. It's not going to be particularly hydrophobic at the low pH that we normally run our methods at. If you increase the pH, it gets more hydrophobic, so we'll get more retention. And therefore, in this instance, we didn't actually use our kind of standard screening method, which would be a low pH method. We decided to move the pH up to pH 6, and that meant that we could get better retention for this analyte of interest. The other conditions are similar to what I've shown. So it's a 10 centimeter 3 mil. We're actually running a longer gradient. So it's a 10-minute gradient in this case, but the flow rate's the same and we're running at 40 degrees. And we set that up on the system as described previously, came back the next day and had a set of 12 chromatograms to look through. So you can see here the chromatogram you get with the C18. We've got coelution of our main API and that 4-aminophenol related substance. Got good separation of peaks 7 and 8, and peaks 9 and 10 look okay. As you go through the different column chemistries, and I've tried to highlight this in the boxes, you can see different resolution is achieved on those kinds of critical peak pairs. So you see I've already got better resolution here on the aromatic, so the C18 phenol type column between peaks 1 and 4. And those are a problem on a lot of the chemistries, but actually this amide, so the polar embedded phase, pulls them apart really nicely. And actually you've got a reverse solution order there. So in my eyes, that's much easier to work with, having that analyte elute before the main API, because if that's a much smaller peak, you're going to be able to see it even if this API peak is very tailed and overloaded. Actually, these two columns at the bottom have good separation of all analytes in the mixture. You can see peaks 9 and 10 are well separated here. In some cases, you've got reverse solution order of some peaks. You can see that for peak 7 and 8. And this is with our methanol diluent mobile fates. We've also got the chromatograms with acetonitrile. And the first thing to note is the shift in retention time. But also you can see here, when we actually look at how many peaks are resolved, you've got more columns that can resolve those 10 analytes of interest. So that's the big advantage to looking at two different solvent systems. You get that advantage of selectivity related to the solvents as well. So nicely, we've got lots of columns to choose from. We've got a method that we can move forward with just from that initial screen. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out like that, I would say. Here we had a triple API mix and we tried the screen on acetonitrile. We still got coelution of multiple peak pairs in this case. Moving across to methanol did improve the selectivity, but not enough to actually give baseline resolution of all of the analytes of interest, especially those eluting near the API. So this one was a lot more tricky in terms of getting baseline resolution for all of our peaks of interest, but we did have 3 columns that we thought we could move forward with potentially. They showed the best selectivity, and methanol again showed the best selectivity in this case for this mixture of 17 analytes. Here we struggled to do the method development online, so we actually took it offline and utilized some modeling software, which helped us to predict which conditions, and in this case a modification of the gradient method, to give us the best separation, in this case on the C18 amide chemistry column with methanol mobile phase. So we managed to get baseline resolution above 2 for all of the critical peak pairs by utilizing that, that software. In some cases, we've had success straight out, and you can see here when we were looking at a mixture of fat-soluble vitamins, just the significant difference in selectivity you get when you shift between one column and another. It really is worthwhile having at least a second column in your toolkit to utilize that different selectivity and different mechanisms of interaction, because the selectivity is just significantly different across the board. And if you look at the difference in retention windows as well, for example, here, the CNES, everything is coming out really early. You've got coelution of multiple peak pairs. But on the super C18, the retention time is significant. So thinking about those different selectivities, how they're interacting with your analytes of interest can be really helpful. And here we move forward, we took that initial method and optimized it further on the C18 amide, because that showed a good selectivity. We also have used this kind of screening approach for things like parabens. So here you've got the acetonitrile mobile phase composition on all of the 6 chemistries. And then we've got the methanol as well. So you can see slight differences. Sometimes it doesn't look so significant, but actually if you really need to separate out peaks 4 and 5 in this case, it's worth doing the screen, because it could be very challenging to try and separate on some of the other chemistries. Here we took it further. We took that C18AR, we looked at the effects of temperature and of TG, so of gradient, to try and see whether we could optimize that separation further. You can see the longer gradient definitely improves the separation, but also we're paying with time. Do we have enough time? Is this separation good enough? And that's always a factor you need to consider. So our method here ended up with a, I mean, it's a 15-minute gradient, but everything elutes before 7 minutes. In this case, we decided that actually if we change the column dimensions, so here instead of using a 10 centimeter but going to a 5 centimeter, we could halve that runtime and really start to get some more high throughput analysis. And there's still room here to optimize further if you want to get this to a shorter runtime, potentially going to a 2 centimeter column, or increasing the flow rate. If you think about the scaling of the gradient, potentially that could be a way to optimize it even further. So talked a lot. Hopefully I've shown you some examples of how we've utilized different column chemistries. Those chemistries are available as method development kits. They come in packs of 3. So again, if you don't have a column switcher capable of 6 columns, you could have 3 well-chosen columns, and hopefully these kits can support that. I'd always look at the analyte chemistry when you're starting out your method development. Go back, look at what types of columns have been used for certain applications, and MacMod have got a great database you can go into, as well as individual resources based on different application areas. So that's a good place to start if you can't do a full 6-column screen as well. And then when you get further into the method development, once you've chosen the chemistry, translating it down to a smaller particle size, a shorter dimension, maybe increasing the flow rate, all of that can be supported using our translation tool as well. So this makes your life a bit quicker. You can do things offline without having to do so many experiments. Hopefully I've shown you how selectivity can be helpful in chromatography, choosing different column stationary phases and utilizing different organic modifiers can really help to give you a good selectivity space and more opportunity to separate out those analytes of interest. You don't have to spend days and weeks and months trying different things. This screening approach should hopefully give you, in an overnight run, a good starting point to then optimize further. And if you have got access to those types of offline calculators and modeling software, again, that can help speed things up. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for your attention. If you've been with me for all 3 sessions, thank you so much for sticking it out. And with that, I'll pass back to Alex to see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. That was a great presentation on selectivity. I know I've learned quite a bit, even though I hear about selectivity from you all the time, but every time I hear a little nugget, something new that I can take. So we will now move on to the Q&A portion of the presentation. Just reminding you that if you have any questions for Gemma, please type them into the question box. Please include your name and company so that if we do not have time to get to your question, we have the ability to contact you and send you an answer via email. So the first question, what 6 columns did you use for your selection model?
So I think in this case, we use the 6 columns that were in the first slide for everything. We have generally used those 6 columns for all of our screens, I would say. I was just trying to get back to that first slide. Bear with me. This one, so these are our 6 columns, making sure that they are different, I would say, and choosing columns that definitely have different mechanisms of retention. So aromatic groups, polar embedded groups, the dipole groups, those are really important, making sure your columns are different from one another. And there's different ways you can assess that. So you can, I mean, one of the most simple ones is something that has been highly publicized, where you take probes and you run those probes down column A under one set of conditions, you run them on column B under the same set of conditions, and then you plot the retention times. And if everything is on a line, if it's a good match, then your columns have the same selectivity. If they are scattered, if you have a really wide scatter plot, then your columns are very different because they're giving you different retention of your compounds. And those are the columns you want to choose for method development. So things that are very different from one another under the same conditions. And that really is one of the problems we had in the past when we just had a short linked phenol in our screen. Everything came out really early in terms of retention, whereas when we've got this C18AR, which has got more carbon, but still that phenolic selectivity, then you get the results in the same separation window. So again, that's something to look at when you're choosing columns, that you are getting similar kind of retentions for hydrophobicity.
Okay. If I only have a 2-column switcher, would this approach still work? And which columns would you pick?
It's a good question. I would still go for the C18 as my first column. Maybe I'd go for something like a super C18, which has got a wider pH range, and then a second column that's got a wide pH range, because then I could look at not only 2 selectivities, but I could also look at 2 organic modifiers and 2 pHs. So that could be another kind of dimension when you're doing your method development, if you've only got that 2-column switcher to play with pH, because again, we've seen massive differences in selectivity when you're analysing ionizable compounds, of course, by changing the pH between sort of high and intermediate or high and low pH.
Okay. I'm not 100% sure if this question may be relevant for ACE columns, but do you have a suggestion on which columns would be a good starting point for polymer-based functional groups?
In terms of, so depends which kind of polymeric groups I'd say. We might have to go back and ask a bit more about that one. We haven't really done much polymer analysis on silica-based columns. Most of the polymers we've analysed have been on polymeric columns because things tend to get a bit sticky on silica. But it will depend heavily on what the polymer is, how big it is, etc. So I think we should probably go back on that one and maybe start from the applications database and go from there.
Okay. So I think that's all the time we have for today. If you did have a question that we did not get to, we will follow up with you via email. And just a reminder, we will send an email with a link to the recording and the slides a few days after the webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. This will be our last webinar for 2024. So we wish you the best to the end of the year and have a great new year and happy holidays.